The current session is China and Russia, an uncertain future. We've already heard a little bit about China and Russia in the first session. Obviously, we're hearing about China and Russia every day, pretty much all the time. Let me first introduce our moderator, who will then go on to introduce the other speakers. And Zheng Liu is a Vice President of International Research and the Director of the Center for Pacific Basin Studies at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. He is also a Policy Fellow at CEPR. His current research interests are macroeconomics, monetary economics, and international finance. He's published articles in many peer-reviewed academic journals, including the American Economic Review, Econometrica, and a bunch of others that I'm not going to go through. His many. American Economic Journal, Macro, Journal of Monetary Economics, and so forth. His research has been cited in U.S. congressional testimony and by many media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Bloomberg, Reuters, and Washington Post. His work on China's capital controls and monetary policy was awarded the 2016 Sun Yifang Prize, China's highest award in economics and finance. Zheng completed his PhD and master's in economics at the University of Minnesota and his BA and MA in economics at Renmin University of China. Before joining the Federal Reserve in 2008, Zheng was an associate professor of economics at Emory University. He has also taught courses at Clark University, the University of Minnesota, and Shanghai Jiao Tong University. He served as a technical advisor for the IMF and a visiting scholar at the University of Minnesota, Boston University, the Federal Reserve Banks of Atlanta and Minneapolis, and the European Central Bank. He has many, many more accomplishments that I could go through, but let's get to the session. We're really fortunate to have him as a moderator and three terrific panelists. So Zheng, take it away.
Right. Thank you, Mark, for the nice introduction. Unlike the previous session, we will jump right to the discussion. But before that, let me briefly introduce our panelists. Here we have three distinguished panelists, starting from the far left of me. Min-Shin Pei is a professor from Claremont McKenna College, and he has published multiple papers and many books on China, Russia, the transition of these countries. And he has published many articles in news media, New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. It's a long list of accomplishments I don't have time to read. And next, sitting next to him is Catherine Stoner, who is a professor at the Stanford. She's also a senior fellow at the Hoover. And Catherine is an expert on Russia, and she's going to tell us more about what her views about Russia is and how the situation, the war in particular, could be resolved. We'll get to that. And Changtai Xie is a professor of economics at the Chicago Booth. He's a top expert in the research of China's economic reform and transition. And also he's done a lot of work about China's productivity and other research. So I'm glad to have all three distinguished scholars joining us for today's panel. So just to motivate a little bit about the issue here, I have a few slides, maybe just a couple I'll show you. So we know that in China, there's a slowdown. I should go back. How do I go back? The first slide. Go back to the first. Okay, there. So we see this growth rate in blue. That's the actual GDP growth rate. In recent years, it has been slowing gradually. And Q3, the last number they reported just last week was about 4.9% year over year. It was better than expected, but there's some issues with data. Official statistics may not be that reliable. Sometimes they just, if the data doesn't look good, they just don't report it. The other line I plot here is an alternative measure of activity. It's using information from a multiple series like consumer confidence, rail freight shipments, electricity production, and so on. It's basically a variation of the Li Keqiang index. Li Keqiang was the former premier of China who sadly passed away yesterday, and he was one of the reformists in the Chinese government. So the actual or the implied growth rate of China from this alternative indicators show that the growth could be worse than we thought. So now with this growth slowdown, we are going to get to the, it's very important to understand what is going on in China, what's driving this slowdown, and is there anything the government could do or willing to do to stimulate the growth? In the longer term, however, I think it's another important issue is will China keep growing and reach high level of income like Korea and Japan in the past? Or would China just enter this middle income trap where they stop growing when the income reach certain level? So over the first 3 decades after China implemented this reform and openness to the world, China grew at a miraculous rate of about 10% per year for 30 years, from 80s, 90s to the 2000s. And then it slowed significantly. But at the same time, if you look at the experience of Japan and Korea in this graph, you can see when those countries have low income, they also grow at a very rapid rate, around 10% in the 60s in Japan and the 70s in Korea. As these countries' income rises over time, the growth slows down. That's a natural process. But the upshot of this graph is that both countries have achieved high income status, and then they grow at a much slower rate, more like an advanced economy. China now, this is an old graph. I took it from one of my earlier writing in 2015. Is China's growth miracle over? Published in the San Francisco Fed Economic Letter Series. So if you update this chart a little bit, you can see now in 2020, 2021, the income per capita in PPP terms in China in real terms is about the level of Japan in the 80s, it's about $15,000 or $17,000 per person. And the growth rate is close to what that curve suggests. It's about 5%, if you look at that graph. So that in itself doesn't really spell trouble for China. It just says China has become richer over time. The growth slowed down, as those other countries did. But the question is more about going forward. What should we expect? Will China keep growing in terms of the income and reaching high income status eventually? Or will they just stop there and get stuck? Our panelists might be able to answer some of those questions. And the next thing I'm going to touch on is the relation with the rest of the world, China, and the trade with the U.S. in particular. We have seen Caroline present a similar chart about the import share from China. The blue line is the share of imports sourced from China to the U.S. So before 2016, actually, that line is rising steadily, and then it stops, it flattens out, and now recently it declined. When we rely less on China, we trade less with China, the U.S. Consumers have to pay. And in fact, the producers also face higher costs, and accordingly, manufacturing sector, the other line shows the labor productivity in that sector is also flattening out. While China was trading a lot with us, manufacturing productivity is rising, but then after that, it flattens. So with this background pictures, I would like to start out the discussion with the panelists. Let me ask a few questions, and you can go this way from Changtai and Catherine and Mingxin. Okay? So the first question obviously has to do with the recent slowdown of China. Do you think it is the government has the ability to restore consumer confidence and to stimulate the economy to grow again? And if so, what kind of policies can they pursue, given that there's lots of issues with the traditional macro policy tools like fiscal stimulus? They have run up a lot of government debt. Local government debt is a big problem now, and the real estate sector is melting down. And the real estate used to be a local government's source of revenue. Now the capacity of fiscal policy is kind of constrained that way. What other policy options do you view the government might be able to explore to stimulate growth? Changtai?
To just reach back to the experience of China in the last 40 years, I think that China is facing two issues right now. And I'll call it, the first issue, I think of it as a short run, potential short run. It could turn into a long run problem, but I think of it as the 1998 problem, which is, what is the 1998 problem? That was the year in which China began to make the transition away from state-owned firms towards private firms. So that was a year in which, so that was the year where they put in place this program, which I think the moniker was grasp the large, let go of the small. So there they faced the problem of, you had 70% of the economy were these money-losing state-owned firms, and they put in place a program it was a program in which the state-owned firms were either privatized or they were closed, or the ones that stayed were changed. They were changed. We can talk more about the details. There was also a change in the financial system. Like in the financial, there was the creation there was a change in the financial system of separating the bad debts into the good debts. And that I think is a short-run problem, because I don't think that there's any question that there has been over-allocation of resources into the real estate sector, right? And then the question is, what do you do about it? You can either keep it going, and that's going to make the long-run problem worse, or you can reallocate or you can begin this reallocation of resources. And maybe on the optimistic side, the scale of this reallocation problem now is actually much, much smaller than the scale of the reallocation problem that they faced in the 1998. The scale of the reallocation problem in 1998 was huge. It was 70% of GDP, and the real estate sector is much smaller. On the other hand, I don't see any signs that they're thinking about it. They're thinking in the right steps, right? And I'll just very quickly say, the other bigger problem, I think of it as a long-run problem, is, I'll call it the 1978 problem, which is, think about where China was in the 1978. I don't think it's really, I don't think it's right to call it a confidence problem. You think about 1978 in some sense, yeah, trivially you could call it a problem of consumer confidence, which is, we don't know whether we're going to go back to the days of the we're going to go back to the days of the Cultural Revolution or not. But I think that is sort of, how the party is thinking about the private sector. I think that is really the bigger long-run issue. And then we can talk later about, if you believe that this is this is the problem, what are the range of feasible solutions to the problem? And I'll end here.
Catherine?
Okay, so I am not an expert on China, but I've been there.
Yes, that makes you an expert.
Right,
Yeah.
and at least once with you, actually. So I will talk more about what Russia and China have in common, perhaps, and then try and work Russia into the relationship. So let me just point out, this is a heavily China-centric panel, of course, the country I study, Russia, happens to be the largest geographically in the world. And with China, has the most number of international borders, right, 14. I think it's tied in this respect. So big, important countries with very different economic profiles, but some similar patterns. So one thing I think is quite similar is a decision to be made, and in Russia it's being made, about renationalization, deprivatization of important parts of the economy. This started about 10 years ago, but it has really picked up speed in the last 2 years in particular, since the war with Ukraine, the invasion began in February 2022. This is also, Russia's in a bit of an economic crisis, of course. However, you may not realize that actually the Russian economy grew this year, defying expectations. So it was expected at the start of the war that it would actually go into at least an 11 or maybe even 12% recession decline, but it actually managed in the first year, and now we're coming through the second year of the war to grow. And so why is that? It's heavily under sanction. These are actually, the sanctions regime is the biggest economy in the world ever attempted. Yet the Russian economy is growing 2.5%. Okay. Some of the, as I said, there's some parallels over the last 30 years with the Chinese economy. And Minchin and I just touched base quickly beforehand. I should confess we went to graduate school together. We taught at Princeton together for 10 years, so we know each other somewhat. He told me he's writing a book about China, what's gone wrong over the last 40 years. And I said, oh, I'm writing that book about Russia, what's gone wrong. Because neither of us can actually go to these countries anymore either. I'm banned, and you're going to be arrested, I'm pretty sure, if you go. So what's gone wrong? Well, they both, the pattern was simpler. It was similar in terms of opening up the economy, right? Both being sort of exciting new economies. The N2 China, obviously, huge population, so you don't necessarily need, and I bet most don't here. I noticed the affiliation of mine you put down on the screen is Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. In fact, we study all of the opposites of those things for the most part, and thus a Russia specialist leading it at the moment. But the pattern was similar, right? China, you can ignore that it's not a democracy. If you're a business person, actually you probably ignore it all over the world because the market is so big. Russia, you could ignore it, right? Except in one or two important sectors, and that's natural gas and, of course, oil. But it also makes a lot of other things. Russia's also biggest aluminum producer in the world. Anyway, opened up its markets. And then Putin gradually, over the last 23 years that he's been at the top of the Russian government, not just president, but also prime minister at various times, has really closed that down. So very interesting pattern, and also attempted to renationalize the economy and now become very aggressive overseas. So what do? China has some similar problems, some different problems. What do you do? Well, I'm going to try and turn the conversation to Russia and China, because Minchin's first book was on Russia and China, or the Soviet Union and China. Well, in Russia's case, cut off from everyone else, turns to its huge neighbor to the east, and so now has this pivot to the east strategy. And in terms of trying to get some sort of economic restart going in China as well, Russia's sort of helpful in that. It's a cheap source at the moment, in particular, of oil and gas. And in fact, China and India have been taking huge advantage of that. I think China, I was just looking at the numbers, China is now the #1 importer or buyer, of Russia's crude oil and coal, second largest buyer of LNG and oil products. The largest buyer of LNG and oil products is I think, China. China is also selling more to Russia increased of 72% since 2021 to $81 billion. They're also kind of at the same point. You mentioned China is 15,000 to 17,000 GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. Russia is actually wealthier, 29,000. So it has some of the same pathology, some different, probably fewer policy options.
Okay. Well, in response to your question is what is ailing the Chinese economy is what I would call a triple whammy. That is, it's economic, geopolitical, and domestic political. So if you want to look at, go back to the list of factors that enable China to grow so fast for, say, from the 80s until about the mid-2010s, practically all of these things have gone. So this is the big picture. And then in terms of the economy, these are what I would consider the factors. One is that China's response to the COVID pandemic, the economic response, is catastrophic, just as its sort of administrative response, because it did not provide any relief to small firms, so the economy was heavily scarred. I don't know the number of firms, but millions probably, micro firms. They just went out of business. And it would take a while for such firms to come back, and that explains the unemployment problem. And then structurally, the economy is heavily indebted. So there is a limit on how much more debt the government can take on. So before COVID, I think the economy was, the debt to GDP, according to BIS data, is somewhere around 250% of GDP. Now it's 300%. So how high can it go? So there's a limit on, and also there's so-called liquidity problem, because if you increase monetary supply, the money will not be actually spent. Then you have the fiscal problem. Well, nominally, China appears to be quite robust in terms of its central fiscal condition, but the government is running an augmented fiscal deficit of 7% of GDP, which is very high for that kind of country. So it really does not have a lot of room on the fiscal side. And on top of that, the economy is partially reformed, which means the state-owned enterprises still consume a lot of resources, waste a lot of resources. The geopolitical side we're all very familiar with, that we're in a Cold War environment. Decoupling, deglobalization, what have you, and that depresses investor sentiment, creates all kinds of uncertainty about the future. I think this year, the Chinese data shows that foreign direct investment is at its lowest level in the last 3 decades. And then domestic political side, we have a regime which is the most ideological, most anti-business, and most, I think, clueless in terms of dealing with its economic problems. So China needs stimulus, and I think it does not need any economic stimulus. It needs political stimulus. I can bet if there's a regime change tomorrow, the Chinese economy will be unrecognizable.
Well, thank you. Both of Changtai and Catherine, you mentioned the 2 important factors behind China's past success, privatization and globalization. So these are important, and Ming-Hsin, you touched on a political regime as well, and those are important factors. So I want to expand a little bit on both fronts, privatization and globalization. So in China, we have seen this a recent crackdown on private firms like Alibaba, Tencent, Wanda. These are giant private entities. And the government just, basically imposed restrictions on their activity and then took over controls of these firms in a lot of cases, like installing a Communist Party member or secretary in the private company. This is really hasn't happened during the entire 30 years since the early 80s, but now it's like, is it reversal of the course? Like, instead of privatization, they're going against that, or is it something else they're doing that can be offsetting this kind of intervention? So that's one thing I want to start out, and then I'll go to globalization. But now I'll start with you.
Yeah, so let me just, let me just say, I don't think it's correct to say that the current Chinese government is anti-private business. I think that if you ask, I think that ideally they would love to have a thriving private sector under certain conditions. And it's the under certain conditions which is key, which is key. But there's a narrative out there which is that has China given up on the market, given up on reforms, and is going back to the ways of Mao. I mean, every week there's a headline in the Wall Street Journal that says that. I think that's not the right way to frame it. The frame it. I think my guess, and I love to know what the Mingxin thinks about this, because I think my guess is that it fundamentally comes down to this tension between the political goals and the economic goals. So there's one thing that I'm seeing, just watching the current Chinese regime, is that they seem to have a worldview where they see enemies everywhere. They see enemies in the world. They see enemies also domestically. And there's this view that if they don't crack down on these enemies, if they don't show a strong hand, that's sometimes the way I want to say it, then they're going to go the way of the Soviet Union. I mean, the analogy with the Soviet Union is brought up again and again. So if I think about some of the crackdowns that you mentioned, my sense of what's going on was that it's not because they disliked what these companies were doing. It's because certain people were viewed as political threats. Jack Ma was viewed as a threat. Whether it's true or not, and I would love to somebody to give me some insight on whether, I guess there are two things that I don't know, right? Whether these guys really are enemies of the party, or whether this is like a phantom. And the second thing is whether this is about the party or whether this is about Xi. Right? Or whether the party feels this way, or whether it is just Xi that is just, let me just call it neurotic, right? Like thinking that everybody in the world is around them. I think that ideally what they would love to have is to have, it's been phrased to me by somebody in China like this. Like they want to have a communist party in control of an economy like the German one. What is special about the German economy? That it's dominated by incredibly productive small and medium-sized firms. Small and medium-sized. What is it that's special about? Why are small and medium-sized firms important? Well, it's because they're small and medium-sized. They're small and medium-sized. That they're not these multi-billionaires that like think about somebody like Jack Ma that starts to buy up newspapers, that starts to buy up media, and that's viewed as being dangerous. So I think that's sort of, I think that's the tension that they're trying to square, because I think they fully understand that having a robust economy is also important to political power, right? And it's about trying to square these multiple objectives.
So just to follow up on that, I'll go to you guys and get your thoughts on this. So there seem to be some potential, this is a conflicting goal. You want tight political control on one hand, and on the other hand, you want the economy to grow. So you have to allow some breathing room. By killing this, cracking down as big private firms, it chills the incentive for those smaller firms who aspire to these big firms. So would that model be sustainable or be even feasible to achieve? And when the economy starts growing, maybe there's more demand for a more democratic political regime, and that might run into a conflict with this current model with tight political control and losing up on the small and medium farm. So any thoughts on this? Guys, Ming-Xin, maybe you can start.
Yeah, well, how do I respond, right? This is just so much. First, I think there were several important questions. Is it about the regime or is it about Xi? It's actually about both. Because the regime produces Xi, let's not forget this, okay? Xi cannot get to the top in any other system except in that kind of system. So we have to sort of put that on the table. And another thing I think about, it's not about paranoia, it's about a sense of embedded insecurity. This is a regime that knows that it does not have a popular mandate, to the extent it used to have one, and that's based on the economy. But when you have a change of leadership and a new leader believes that he has to rule through fear rather than rule through incentives, then you have the wholesale change we've seen in the last 10 years. And today we are witnessing the outcomes. And whether the party likes private business, to the party, there is no such thing as private property because the party believes it owns everything. So the distinction is quite academic. How the party treats private property, you can see the party never makes the distinction. As long as I control the means of violence, I own you. I can do whatever I want with you. For a long time, the party did not do this because the party's leadership identified its immediate interests and long-term survival with the private sector. But when that understanding or when that judgment is not there, then the party shows its true nature, which is, well, we all know. I don't want to use that phrase because one of that kind of, it really has total disregard. So whether you're small, you're big, it doesn't matter. A lot of small business owners have suffered. Actually, Jack Ma probably has fared a lot better than most other private sector owners who are now either in jail or have lost their businesses. So anyway, so this is, I think, a lot to, yeah.
I would just say the patterns are strikingly similar. So Mikhail Khodorkovsky is the Jack Ma of the Russia story, right? That this is an autocrat. This is an oligarch that owned a lot of. He was Russia's richest man. He owned a lot of valuable companies in oil, in particular, but also media. Putin, had him arrested in 2003. He spent 10 years in jail. And he now lives abroad, but is divested of those assets. They're all renationalized, or I won't go into the story. But and in that way, he brings basically these very, very rich, all of them men, under control. So they don't do anything without checking in first. There are so many things that Putin's Russia and Xi's China and Putin
are good friends. There's a reason.
They have They have right. What do they call it? A no limits partnership. They declared in February of 2022. They are about the same age. They both have this. We are under siege from the rest of the world. Actually, in particular, not the rest of the world, the West, and that means Europe and the United States. So what has Putin done? Well, he's tightened up the economy, so people are accountable more to him personally. One big difference here is that China has political structures and institutions. Russia really has, it's very fluid, right? And there's so much now dependence that has evolved on Putin personally. So that, I think, is a very interesting and important difference, right? But they do see enemies everywhere, and so they now China and Russia have the best relationship they've had in more than 100 years or so. Putin is going to the global south. She is going to the global south as well. So if we look even at the war in Ukraine, very different perspective in the global south on the war in Ukraine than in the West, right? They're actually kind of pro-Russia. Why? Putin's been moving around the world, as has she and Belt and Road for the last 10 to 12 years, building relationships, helping out, marketing blood diamonds, things like that. Expanding BRICS, selling what they can, but they don't compete, China and Russia, in this way. I will say one thing, though. I wanted to point out that there are autocrats. Previously, Putin, and we can't look, I can talk about public opinion polls now, but we can't take those seriously at the moment, in the last 2 or 3 years in particular. Putin has been viewed as very competent, right? Whether Bill Clinton was president here in the United States when the dot-com boom happened in Silicon Valley, like a good politician, he took credit for that. Putin, presided over the Russian economy when it was growing 7 to 8% year on year in the early to mid 2000s. Now he doesn't look so competent. He's made this huge mistake. There's a very tight labor market in Russia. There are probably 250,000 casualties on the Russian side from the war so far. One of my friends who watches the war in Ukraine quite closely said that Russia has the second most capable army or military in Ukraine right now. It wasn't supposed to go that way, right? So people are gradually you're starting to see signs of people getting unhappy. COVID, a crisis of Xi's own making. The war in Ukraine, a crisis of Putin's own making after looking so competent for so long. So you quote about modernization theory by saying maybe when the economy grows, people will come out on the streets and demand more. That kind of happened in China, and it kind of happened in Russia. And what we have are autocrats who shut it down right away and use the power of the state. So, I think they're stuck. Their politics are the enemies of their economies right now.
Can I just add 2 things? I guess I want to put pushback on two things. First, I don't think that this alliance between China and Russia is real. And maybe the way I'll put it is that whenever Xi Jinping has a grandchild, and that grandchild is 18 years old, and that grandchild faces the choice between going to Moscow State and Stanford and chooses to go to Moscow State, I will believe it.
Sure. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. But he's not trying to get Chinese students to go to Moscow State. He's trying to get Ugandan students to go to Moscow State.
Yes.
The second thing I want to say is I like to push back a bit on sort of this notion that the Chinese Communist Party does not care about private business. I think that they really do. I think that they really do. It's just that there's this other goal that they have.
They care about them as long as they control them.
As long as they have control of it. But most of the time, like if I think about, like let me just say that like there's this a whole bunch of things that I started to see starting at about 2014 to about 2020 that none of it has been reported in the media. And I'll just give one tiny example of this. In 2012, Carolyn, you may know this, like the Chinese premier in 2012 found out about the World Bank doing business indicators. And China was ranked 158 in the world in the World Bank doing business. And this was Wen Jiabao was furious about this, and so he sent orders to the Chinese directors at the World Bank to shut down this project, to shut down the World Bank doing business project. The World Bank responded as any good bureaucracy does, formed a committee, right? To form the committee. I think it was a committee led by the finance minister of South Africa. I think that's what it was. They met for a year. They came up with some changes to the World Bank doing business indicators that mollified the Chinese. There's also the story of what happened in 2019 that almost led to the head of the IMF losing her job, but we can talk about that another day. So But what is really curious about this story is that after fighting the World Bank doing business indicator so hard, what I started to see in 2014 is that the Chinese started to roll out essentially a replica of the World Bank doing business indicators throughout China. So there was almost exactly the same questions, and they rolled it out in every single city, in every single province, China, because in that 2-year period they realized, hey, this is actually useful. It's actually useful. And what I started to see is that these local party secretaries, they started to jump to get up their ratings. So in terms of, so that they were responding, because they started to, and that's just like one of the small things that they started to do. They started to create a system of courts. They started to, that was only to settle a business that was only to settle disputes. I would say that the thing that has changed is I didn't quite realize it until, I was back in China this summer, was the COVID shock. And I would say that the COVID shock is not what Minxin, at least my perception of the real COVID shock is not sort of the death of businesses and these other things. It was almost this sense that this social contract or this implicit contract between entrepreneurs and the party has been broken. Like I would say that the mindset of the typical entrepreneur in China was that, look, I know what the rules of the game are. I grow my business. I keep my head out of politics. The local government is going to support what I do. At least if they don't support what I do, they're going to leave me alone. These crazy things that the party does, it happens to dissidents. The crazy things that the party occasionally does, it happens to somebody like Jack Ma. Right? I am not Jack Ma. I'm not Jack Ma. And I didn't quite fully get it when I was watching the lockdowns. But after the fact, I sense that this is the first time that you have these, let me just call it normal people, who start to feel, oh my God, the crazy stuff that I've known all along that the party has ability to do, it starts to happen to me. Right? It can happen to me. So it almost feels to me like the way that people talk about it. It's like a breakdown of a marriage, right? For most marriages, I think, there isn't the rule of law, right? There isn't the set of 30 rules, and then I can go to a court. It's about
They're norms of behavior.
They're norms of behavior. No, they're norms of behavior, and it's all not written, right? It's all not written. And then it felt like these norms have been broken, right? Broken, that the party who I've always had faith in to at least not be crazy, now I think the party is crazy, right? And the party is crazy, then that's going to change my behavior. So again, it's like the breakdown of a marriage. That if you think, once you lose belief in what the other party does, then that changes your behavior.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
No, this is great. It seems I have stimulated debate between this. That's great. This session is titled China-Russia and Uncertain Future. We see a lot of uncertainty, especially in China as well as in Russia. Some arbitrary policy enforcement, the rule is not clear, and then this creates lots of uncertainty in the business environment. So that probably is not conducive to thriving private sector. But going forward, I just want to ask you guys' view. Of course, at the Fed, we always wonder what is the future like, what's going to happen to inflation, what's going to happen to unemployment, and so on. There's always a grain of salt in that kind of forecast. With that in mind, I want to ask you guys to assess, going forward, how China's economy will be doing. Is it going to go to a new normal or stuck in poverty trap, as I mentioned earlier? Or is it going to, find a model which combines tight political control, like a Maoist political model, with a private sector oriented or friendly business environment, some golden combination in that way, and so it can sustain growth further. If you could comment on the future briefly on China, and also if you could just relate that outlook to the rest of the world, like how China's growth prospect will affect the rest of the world. It is a big country, and the U.S. is
Second biggest in the world.
It is, yeah,
Russia's
second biggest, depending on how you measure it.
Bring that up again.
Okay, that's right.
Well, it's a lot of China, and China's really important. But I think it is. Can I just comment on the alliance thing? This is a real alliance. The grandchild test is a really cute one, but I don't think it's I don't think that's a good one, right? Listen, Putin wouldn't send his own grandchild and won't send his own grandchild to a Russian university. They're going to send him abroad, of course. That is one of the great hypocrisies of this particular autocrat. That's not what she is looking for in Russia, and I actually very much doubt, although they've declared they are very best friends in the world, I actually doubt that they are. Nonetheless, the alliance is quote unquote real in that it is strategic, right, and tactical. So it's about opportunity and what they can get from one another. It's not because they love each other and they're nice guys and have a real meeting of the mind and Putin, wants to quote Mao. He doesn't want to quote Mao. He doesn't want communism. He wants state control and his personal control over the state, steal from the state, distribute to his cronies, and if he could die by being the gatherer of the lands again of Imperial Russia, by taking Ukraine and maybe part of Poland if he keeps going, that'd be great too. She is helpful to him, and China is helpful to him now. They were not necessarily helpful to him 20 years ago, but they are helpful now because he cannot sell his oil, gas, coal, and a whole bunch of other things anywhere else in such volume, except India. So he can balance relations between India and China by being a nice guy to both. And in fact, he is. The other big visitor to Russia is Modi, of course. Technically not an autocrat, still governing a democracy. But we'll see about that. 2024, you said, the future. So I'll try and hit your question. 2024 is a big year. It's a big year here in the United States because we may well, elect a candidate, won't say which one, or from which party, who is actually quite likes autocrats and quite likes Putin in particular. This could be I'm not saying who, but what if it happened? But this is actually quite a concern for Ukraine. It's a concern for the Middle East. It's a concern for Europe. It should be a concern for China too, because this candidate is no particular fan of China and the helping the Chinese economy recover in any way. So 2024 is also a big year in Russia because Putin is up for election, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say he's going to win it. But he has to, you're laughing and that's fine. I set it up so that you would. You think he's going to win too, I gather. It's not about whether he wins or not, it's whether he looks legitimate in doing so, right? So the big issue is turnout. And we look at things like that as political scientists because people don't turn out or they will be forced to turn out in some respects in Russia, then that's a sign of lacking legitimacy as well. Not so much the vote outcome, because he can spin that to whatever he wants. This, I think, is highly problematic. The elections in 2024, and also the fact that these are two countries that have this strategic, tactical alliance at the moment, and I will grant that I don't know how deep it goes, but at the moment, and they have a big common enemy, and it's us in the United States and in the West more generally. I'm Canadian, I should say that, but they don't like Canada either. So, I think we have to really think about that as China looks to recover. Who will be in power here, who China will be dealing with in power, and how long it will be able to go on buying cheap energy, which obviously has a huge positive impact potentially on the Chinese economy and its future growth prospects.
Okay, just three sorts of short-term uncertainty. On the geopolitical front, the uncertainty is, can the U.S. and China find a flaw? Because the relationship has been just sinking. We're caught in this downward spiral. Can they find some kind of equilibrium? I think Biden and Xi are actually searching for that. We don't know what's going to happen. And of course, if there's a change of administration next year, then they will have to start all over again. The second uncertainty is decoupling. You might call it reshoring. How extensive? What kind of damage that would be done for the Chinese economy? And the third is, because this round of economic deterioration in China is both structural and cyclical. So in the short term, every pair of eyes is looking at the real estate sector. Can the government actually pull a rabbit out of the hat to deal with this technically very difficult issue? I think if the government can stabilize the real estate sector, which actually contributes to a quarter of the economy, economic growth, that's a big deal. But so far, we just don't see how the government can do this. So these are the three uncertainties that I would look at.
Chante, any further thoughts?
Yeah, so let me just give the summary. My best guess is that China is going to, in the next 20 years, is just going to be another normal country. Like, what I mean by that is that it's going to grow like Mexico. I mean, that's my best guess, which is it's not going to be great. It's not going to be terrible. So it's not going to be terrible. It's just going to be normal. It's just going to be normal. That's my best. That's my best guess. And then sort of the three big things are one is that if the goal of the U.S. is to hold back China, the most effective thing I've seen the U.S. do were these export controls that were rolled out last October. I mean, the Trump tariffs did nothing. I mean, my sense is it was minor, but the export controls I think really were a shock to the system. I think, if the goal the goal is to make sure that the Chinese economy does not grow, I mean that the U.S. is going to do, just do more of that. So the investment controls that are coming out, this is sort of a side note. Maybe the question for the previous panel is what really does the U.S. want with respect to China, right? Does the U.S. want a prosperous China or not prosperous China? You could ask the question on, is the strategic threat by China bigger or less if China was like North Korea? That is, it's a hypothetical question, which means, that's I think that's a question that I think the U.S. hasn't really completely resolved, right? It's still, I think I look at U.S. policy and it just goes back and forth between there's some place of U.S. policy that believes, although they won't say it, that they really would like China to be like North Korea, and there are other parts that say, it's this view that we all prosper when both of us grow, and we just want China not to weaponize. I don't quite know what the truth is, but what the truth is, I think it's a bit of both, right? And I think that there's been no resolution. That's my best guess of what's going on. But that's the first thing on the horizon. Second thing is what is the real estate bubble, and there it's about bringing it down from 15% to some lower number. That I think we know how to do. Right? We know how to do. The question is whether it will be done. Right? The question is whether it will be done. And then part of what's happened in China is that sort of all, sort of the official sources of information, or even the unofficial sources of information that at least I used to have has. It's all been shut down. So before I used to have a sense on what they were thinking. Now I have no sense on what. So part of what's happened in China is that people who would speak openly in private, but they don't do that anymore. So sort of this source of information, I think for most, at least for me, that's dried up. And then the third thing comes back to what I said before, which is how do you deal with what Zheng, you call this lack of confidence, and my interpretation of what that is that it's a breakdown of the beliefs and there I don't really see a way out given the current structure of the party. Like sometimes I've said, well, once or twice I have said to Chinese colleagues, oh, but the most effective thing for them to say is to make a public statement that, gee, you know what? In 2022, we really screwed up. Because, I mean, there's no dispute that they screwed up. But you know, my Chinese colleagues laugh, and I'm sure that Ming-Xin is going to laugh. There's no way in bloody hell that they're ever going to say that they screwed up. All right?
I think they would say, where do we begin if we want to talk about screwing up?
That is an analogy with the Soviet Union. That's what Gorbachev did, right? And how the Soviet Union screwed up, that was called perestroika. And he's lost his seat. So they're not going to do that.
But you know, the brightness that China did do it once. They said that, you know, whatever it was, that 50% of the Cultural Revolution was wrong, the other 50% was right. It was never clarified which was right, which part was the part of right. But they did it, right? They did it, and that was a really important part of turning the page. And then I think that something similar is needed now. For people to understand, oh, you know, this thing that you did to me, that you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it again.
Yeah, there's a critical difference. You can blame the Cultural Revolution because Mao was dead. You cannot blame. You cannot say, well, we screw up when the person responsible for the screwing up is alive and well, and apparently is going to rule for a long, long time.
It does seem like we do face a very highly uncertain future for both China and the relation between China, Russia, and the United States. So with that, I would like to open to the floor for questions. We get the first question here.
Hi, thanks for your panel. One thing I didn't hear regarding both China and Russia, what role, looking out 5, 10, 20 years, do demographics play in terms of policy and prosperity?
Russia first.
Yeah. I can talk about Russia. So one of the catastrophes for Russia in the last 3 years, really, it's a combination of COVID and the war. They actually had recovered. I bet you all know the story where the average Russian male life expectancy was 59 years old in 1997. It actually was going up to about 67. Females are up well over in their mid-70s. It's now back on the decline. And women are not wanting to have babies, and a lot of men of working in family age. Well, I guess you guys never age out, but anyway, they are fighting and dying in Ukraine. So they've also had a huge brain drain, right? So we estimate about 1 million people who have high-tech skills have actually left Russia. I have a project on Russian migration to see where they've gone and the effect they're having on the recipient countries as well. But Russia now has a demographic crisis again, a crisis of Putin's making. They had radically improved, and now they're on the way back down. You guys have it. Yeah. China's demographic.
Well, China, I think when you look at the data, the demographics become a real problem in the next decade, not this decade. This decade is actually the median age and the U.S. median age about the same. The next decade, the government is not doing that much because it needs to raise retirement age. They still have this ridiculously low retirement age, male at 60, female at 55. So that's and they don't want to do this because the short-term costs is that they have to create jobs. In the immediate future, the problem is not aging; it's unemployment. So they are trading. It's a trade-off. But so far, they just the real problem is that Chinese women have the birth rate really has collapsed. This is all the data we have probably have underestimated the grim future. 2 decades from now.
Perhaps the one-child policy and the sex imbalance is also part of the problem.
One-child policy is gone. The problem is that they cannot make people reproduce. That's their problem. Yeah.
Chante, you have anything to add? Okay.
Skip.
Yeah.
Great.
May I? So 10 years ago at this conference, and perhaps some of you were still, were actually speaking, something that stuck with me is one of the people said, China has always been invaded from the West, not by the West, okay, but the internal part of the country, which was poorer versus the coast, caused people to have a shift in power. And so the issue was the poor people in China. And as a result, the observation was the biggest risk in China would be 100 million unemployed young men. And they said it was a special case because in the Middle East we have the same problem, but they all live in different countries. In China, they live in one country. And so this fear of the enemy within and this breakup of the marriage, are we at a point where this insight from 10 years ago, we're reaching this problem? You just mentioned unemployment. It seems like the overriding issue. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it will probably be reflected in more crime, more social unrest, but not in the kind of political upheaval we saw during the Arab Spring. Let's not forget, we may have 100 million unemployed young people, but we also have a very powerful Communist Party. The Communist Party is 96 million people, and it has a huge surveillance state. It has police, secret police. So I'm not worried about the unemployment driving regime change. I think it will cause it may affect politics, but through different intermediate mechanisms.
Okay. Yes.
Can you comment on Taiwan, and does it help China to invade Taiwan, hurt China, or what's your view, or will it be held until Xi needs something to distract the world?
This is what I call a $10 billion trade, right? If you make the right call, then I think I can treat everybody here to a bottle of Lafitte. I think depends on, I think maybe you should tell us first Putin's thinking about invading Ukraine. And the same kind of calculation applies to Taiwan.
Yeah, what was
Does it help Russia to invade Ukraine?
No, I think it's hurt. So we've had a lot of conversations across the street at the Freeman Spogli Institute, it's the sister institute to CEPR here, that about what, if anything, has she learned about learned from, or what lessons is he taking from Putin's experience with Ukraine? So. I don't know she's thinking necessarily. Putin's thinking was that this would be quick and easy, and that the Ukrainian people wanted to be liberated by the Russian military, and that when the Russian military asked the Ukrainian military to lay down its arms, it would do so. They would do so, and that Zelensky would flee. It turns out, with a pretty extensive intelligence apparatus, that was wrong. All of those assumptions. We have certainly in the US gotten intelligence wrong with respect to Iraq. And so what she should notice is that intelligence will matter, right? Second, it turns out that the US and Europe were a lot more aligned and that in responding and imposing sanctions and really trying to isolate Russia than was expected, both by Europeans and Americans, but also, I think, by Putin. So I would imagine looking at that and seeing Russia's economy was doing okay. They had low debt, they had balanced budgets before this. They had long-term other problems. Something no one's touched on is corruption. Russia's got a lot of corruption. But actually could have gone on growing at a pretty steady 3, maybe 4% clip. It's growing a bit now, but it's never going to recover, right? This is just devastating. 30 years of improvement, and it's all gone to hell in a handbasket. So it would seem to me, looking at that experience, she, who's not many things but not stupid, would look at that and think, maybe now is not the right time to do this, given these economic problems I have, and youth unemployment in particular. Let's wait until there's a better moment, perhaps.
Short answer is a military takeover of Taiwan is a bad proposition for China.
Yeah,
now, in the intermediate future, or forever, because it doesn't do China any good.
Right. Yeah.
But on the other hand, if Taiwan declares independence, China will have no choice but to declare war. So what we worry at the moment is, of course, this extreme thinking. She can think otherwise like Putin did. But what we worry, people who watch Taiwan like me on a almost daily basis, is that there is this intermediate gray zone. Problem is nobody knows where the red line, short of declaring independence on an open tech is. And a lot of bad stuff can happen in that gray zone.
Let me just say that. So I'll just say I have no idea what the thinking on the Chinese side is, but I can tell you with some confidence on what the thinking on the Taiwanese side is. On the Taiwanese side is that they think that a full-out invasion is really, really unlikely. What they think is very likely is exactly this gray zone. Is this gray area? What if you start to stop some ships? What if you start to, block imports of liquid natural gas, which Taiwan, that powers 70% of its electricity? What if you take over one tiny island that's 2 miles off the shore of China? So there are a couple. I don't know, for those who know about the history, there are a couple of islands which are just 1 or 2 miles off the coast of China that are controlled by Taiwan. I mean, is that going to be considered an invasion? So, and then I don't think that we in the U.S., the world, have thought about, what exactly is the red line, right? Is the red line. But I think that's what the Taiwanese are thinking is the most likely thing to happen, and then they're trying to think through of, when do we? It's sort of like if I think about sort of the way that people talk about like wars. Like right now, a lot of people are bringing up this fabulous book by, what's it called? The Guns of August, right? That book about the origin of World War I, where
Barbara Tuchman.
Barbara Tuchman, that the story about of those few months, after the assassination of the Archbishop, in which nobody.
Archduke.
The Archduke, right? In which nobody wanted war, but then everybody just escalated until a war was inevitable. That's one analogy. The other historical analogy is Munich, 1938, which is that you try not to escalate. You try not to escalate, and by choosing not to escalate, you're sending the wrong signal. Right, you're choosing that, and then the question is, what's the right model, right? Is the right model 1914 or the right model 1938? And I think if I were to summarize the thinking of the Taiwanese, they don't quite know whether they should do the 1938 or do the 1914.
Or a third model, which is lean on an alliance to deter. Which
a Cold War model.
Yeah.
But then the question is, that partner, does a partner work with the model of 1914 or work with the model of 1938? That just defers the problem, right?
So maybe we'll take one more quick question. Be brief, please. I see a few hands in the middle.
Where, please?
Yeah.
Right here.
Biden is going to meet with Xi in November, it seems. It seems there's a lot of good economic win-win potential areas of cooperation, but it's more complicated than just the economic logic. There's also a lot of the political. Do you foresee areas of collaboration in this meeting coming up in November?
You mean the San
United
Francisco
States. Yeah.
summit? No, I don't think we should put a lot of hope on those meetings because the dynamics, the dynamics driving the relationship are really powerful. There's no trust. In the U.S., you have one party, which is the Republicans, which is going to punish Biden for anything or attack Biden for any concessions he makes. So I think the best we can do is to count on some kind of lowering of the temperature, and then they do one thing at a time. But the climate, we all talk about climate, right? Everybody is worried about climate. But the moment you get into the details, it's about competition. It's not about collaboration. So keep your expectations low. Mike, the best hope is, for me, is that the two countries can manage their tensions so skillfully as to avoid a direct military conflict. If they can do that, I think we should all be very happy.
All right, thank you all, and it's right on time. Let's give the panelists a round of applause.